It was supposed to be a regular morning. Danny Hayes, a 46-year-old retired Navy veteran, had developed a routine since leaving the service. An early jog, a hearty breakfast, and a quiet afternoon in the sunlit corners of his small Ohio town. Danny had seen enough in his 25 years in the Navy. He was proud of his service, but he preferred the quiet life now. His days of commanding ships and navigating high-stakes waters were behind him. Still, the discipline stayed with him. The habit of checking doors twice, the instinct to survey his surroundings, always aware. He couldn't shake that. Danny lived alone in a modest house on Maple Street. His wife, Claire, had passed away from cancer 5 years ago, and though the house still bore her touch, family pictures, her favorite antique vase in the corner, the place often felt empty without her laughter. Yet, he stayed in the home they had built together. It was his anchor, his last link to her. That's where it all started, or so I thought at the time. On a chilly Monday morning, Danny found a note pinned to his door. He couldn't have known it then, but this piece of paper marked the beginning of a deadly spiral. It was typed, brief and unsettling. "You don't know me, but I know you. Meet me at McKinley Park at 2 p.m. tomorrow. You'll want to hear what I have to say." No signature. No explanation. Danny stared at the note for a long moment, his military training making him skeptical. He was too smart to just walk into a situation like that blindly. But curiosity has a way of gnawing at a man, especially a man like Danny, who had always trusted his instincts. He decided to go. At 2 p.m. the following day, Danny arrived at McKinley Park. The park was a quiet patch of green in the middle of the town, mostly used by dog walkers and families on weekends. Today, it was nearly empty. Danny stood by the fountain, scanning the area with those sharp, trained eyes of his. There was no one suspicious in sight, just a woman sitting on a bench under a large oak tree, reading a book. She looked up briefly, catching Danny's eye before returning to her pages. After 15 minutes of waiting, Danny was about to leave when the woman closed her book, stood up, and started walking towards him. She looked to be in her late 30s, dark hair tied back, and dressed in a simple jacket and jeans. As she approached, Danny felt an odd sense of recognition, though he was sure they'd never met. "Mr. Hayes?" she asked, her voice low but steady. Danny nodded. "You're the one who left the note?" She glanced around, her eyes darting nervously before locking onto his. "Yes. I had no choice. You need to know something about Amanda." The name struck him like a punch to the gut. Amanda? That was his girlfriend. Well, more like his former girlfriend, as things had gotten rocky recently. Amanda Jones was 34, the manager of a local diner. She and Danny had met about a year ago, not long after her own divorce. The attraction had been immediate, but lately, things had started to unravel between them. Amanda had become distant, secretive, like she was hiding something. Danny had assumed it was just personal issues from her past creeping in, but this woman, whoever she was, seemed to suggest otherwise. Danny narrowed his eyes. "Who are you?" "My name is Rachel. I'm Amanda's neighbor. I've been watching her with him." "With who?" Danny's voice dropped, turning colder. Rachel took a deep breath. "His name's Mark. They've been having an affair for months now. I've seen them together, meeting in secret, going places where they think no one will notice. I thought you should know. I thought you deserve to know." Danny stood there, rigid, processing what she was saying. The words didn't fully sink in at first. An affair? Amanda had been distant, sure, but she wouldn't. No, she couldn't. But Rachel's expression told him otherwise. "Why should I believe you?" Danny asked, his voice tight. "I'm not asking you to," Rachel replied, her face softening, "but you should talk to her. Ask her about Mark. You'll see for yourself." That night, Danny sat in his living room, the silence in the house pressing down on him. He thought about calling Amanda, confronting her, but something in him stopped short. He needed to see her in person. Tomorrow, he'd go to her house and ask her straight. The following morning, Danny drove to Amanda's place, a small 2-story home on the edge of town. His heart pounded as he knocked on the door. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time, but still, nothing. It was then that he noticed her car wasn't in the driveway. Maybe she was out, or maybe Danny walked around to the back of the house, where he found a window slightly ajar. Without thinking, he reached in and popped it open. Once inside, he moved quietly through the house, his senses on high alert. The place felt empty, but there was a faint sound coming from upstairs. Footsteps. He climbed the stairs slowly, the old wood creaking under his weight. As he reached the top, he heard voices. A man's voice, low and murmuring, followed by Amanda's familiar laugh. It was a laugh he hadn't heard in weeks, maybe months. Danny pushed open the door to the bedroom and froze. There she was, Amanda, standing by the bed, laughing with a man who was too close, too comfortable in her space. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, and younger than Danny by at least a decade. He turned at the sound of the door opening, his face hardening when he saw Danny. Everything fell into place at that moment. The distance, the excuses, the lies. All of it led to this. Amanda's betrayal was real, and it hit him like a tidal wave. The man took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists. "You must be Danny," he said, his tone mocking. "Guess you weren't supposed to find out like this." Amanda looked pale, her eyes wide with shock and guilt. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The look on her face was enough. Danny's heart raced. He wasn't an impulsive man, but rage was boiling inside him. The man, Mark, he guessed, was smirking, enjoying the show. But Danny wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of seeing him break. Without a word, Danny turned and left the room. That should have been the end of it. Danny should have walked away and never looked back, but he couldn't let it go. Amanda's betrayal festered in him, a slow-burning flame that refused to die. Little did Danny know, the next time he crossed paths with Mark, it would end in murder. A few days passed since Danny had discovered Amanda with Mark, and though he hadn't spoken to her since, her silence was just as telling. She didn't call, didn't explain, didn't even try to apologize. It was as if she had erased him from her life overnight. But Danny, despite everything, couldn't erase her. His mind kept circling back to the night he found them together. Every detail, every word, replayed in his head like a tape stuck on repeat. There was no mistaking the way Amanda looked at Mark. It was a look Danny hadn't seen from her in a long time. He'd been replaced. But it wasn't just the affair that gnawed at him. It was Mark himself. The way the younger man had smirked at him, almost daring Danny to do something about it. That arrogance, that smugness. It set something off deep inside Danny, something dark and uncontrollable. By Friday evening, he couldn't take it anymore. He needed answers, and he needed closure. He decided to confront Amanda again, to force her to explain herself. Maybe, just maybe, she'd realize she'd made a mistake. Maybe there was a way to fix this, to put it all behind them. Danny drove to Amanda's house, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. The setting sun cast long shadows over the small town, but Danny's mind was consumed with thoughts of betrayal. As he pulled into her driveway, he noticed a familiar car parked across the street. Mark's car. His pulse quickened. Without thinking, Danny got out of the car and marched toward Amanda's front door. Before he could knock, the door swung open, and there she was, Amanda, standing in the doorway, her expression a mixture of surprise and annoyance. "Danny, what are you doing here?" Her voice was sharp, cold. "I came to talk," he said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "We need to talk about this. About what I saw." Amanda crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. "There's nothing to talk about. You saw what you saw. I've moved on, Danny. We're done." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. "Just like that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "After everything we've been through?" Amanda shrugged, her eyes flickering briefly with something that resembled guilt, but it was quickly replaced by indifference. "People change. I've changed." Behind her, Danny caught a glimpse of movement. Mark appeared in the hallway, his presence filling the space with an air of dominance. He leaned casually against the wall, his arms crossed, watching the exchange with a small smirk playing on his lips. "You heard her, old man," Mark said, his voice dripping with condescension. "It's over. Why don't you just walk away while you still can?" Danny's hands balled into fists at his sides. He took a step forward, his anger rising. Stay out of this. This is between me and her. Mark laughed softly, stepping closer. You don't get it, do you? She's with me now. So why don't you take the hint and leave before things get ugly? Amanda remained silent, her eyes fixed on the ground as if she couldn't bear to look at Danny anymore. That hurt more than anything. Danny's blood boiled. All the rage, the betrayal, the humiliation, it all surged up inside him, pushing him past the point of reason. He took another step toward Mark, his eyes locked on the younger man, daring him to make the next move. You think you're tough? Danny said through clenched teeth. You think you can just waltz in here and take everything I had? Mark's smirk widened. What are you gonna do about it, old man? You're not in the Navy anymore. This isn't your war. That was it. That was the line. Without thinking, Danny lunged at Mark, shoving him hard against the wall. The two men grappled for a moment, but Mark was younger, stronger, and quicker. He twisted out of Danny's grip and shoved him back, causing Danny to stumble and fall to the floor. Amanda screamed, but she didn't move to help either of them. She just stood there, frozen in shock. Danny scrambled to his feet, his vision blurred with rage. He didn't care anymore, about consequences, about reason. All he wanted was to wipe that smug look off Mark's face. He charged again, this time swinging wildly. But Mark was ready. He dodged the punch and grabbed Danny by the arm, twisting it painfully behind his back. Danny gasped, feeling a sharp pain shoot up his shoulder. You should have walked away when you had the chance, Mark hissed in his ear. Then, with a brutal shove, he pushed Danny down the steps, sending him sprawling onto the driveway. Danny lay there for a moment, gasping for air, his body aching from the fall. Above him, Mark stood at the top of the steps, his eyes cold and unfeeling. Amanda, too, was watching, but her face was unreadable. You don't belong here anymore, Danny, Mark said. Stay away from her. If I see you near her again, you won't get off this easy. With that, Mark turned and walked back inside, slamming the door behind him. Danny lay on the cold concrete for what felt like an eternity. His pride was shattered, his body bruised, but more than that, his heart was broken. He had lost her, lost Amanda to that arrogant bastard, and there was nothing he could do about it. Except there was. A dark thought crossed Danny's mind, one that he couldn't shake. Mark had taken everything from him, his dignity, his pride, his woman, and now Mark had made it clear that Danny wasn't welcome in Amanda's life anymore. But Danny wasn't the type to just walk away. Not after everything he had been through. Not after what he had seen in the service. No, Mark had made a mistake. He had underestimated just how far a man like Danny could be pushed. That night, Danny didn't sleep. He sat in his living room, staring out the window into the darkness, a plan forming in his mind. It wasn't about winning Amanda back anymore. It was about revenge. It was about making Mark pay for what he had done. The next few days passed in a blur. Danny watched. He waited. He learned Mark's routine. When he left the house, when he returned, what bars he frequented. Mark was predictable, cocky. He didn't know someone was watching, didn't realize just how vulnerable he was. Danny waited for the right moment, the perfect opportunity to strike. And when it finally came, he didn't hesitate. It was a Thursday night, late, and Mark had just left a bar on the outskirts of town. Danny followed him in his car, keeping his distance, his heart pounding with anticipation. Mark drove to a deserted stretch of road just outside the city, the kind of place where no one would hear you scream. Danny sped up, his headlights flashing in Mark's rearview mirror. Mark noticed, slowing down and pulling to the side of the road, clearly annoyed by the tailgating. Danny pulled up behind him, stepping out of his car, his pulse racing. Mark got out of his car, his face twisted in anger. What the hell do you think you're? Before he could finish, Danny swung. The tire iron in his hand connected with the side of Mark's head with a sickening crack. Mark stumbled, disoriented, blood streaming down the side of his face. He tried to steady himself, but Danny was relentless. He swung again and again, each blow fueled by months of anger, betrayal, and pain. By the time Danny stopped, Mark was lying motionless on the ground, his body twisted and broken. The only sound was Danny's heavy breathing, the cold wind howling through the trees. He stood over Mark's lifeless body, his mind blank, his heart pounding in his chest. He had done it. He had crossed the line. There was no turning back now. But as the reality of what he had done began to sink in, Danny felt a cold dread creep over him. He hadn't just beaten a man. He had killed him. And now, there would be consequences. The worst was yet to come. Danny stood over Mark's body, the realization of what he'd done settling in. He had killed a man. His mind raced, struggling between guilt and a cold, military-trained logic. He couldn't undo this, but he could cover it up. There was no other choice. After wrapping Mark's body in a tarp, Danny drove to an abandoned quarry on the outskirts of town. The place was desolate, the perfect hiding spot. With a grunt, he rolled the body into the deep pit, watching it disappear into the darkness. He felt a moment of grim satisfaction. He had cleaned up the mess. For now. But the calm didn't last. The next morning, over coffee, Danny overheard two women gossiping at the diner. Mark was missing. Amanda had reported him to the police. A cold dread filled Danny. He had thought he'd covered his tracks, but now the police were involved. How long before they came knocking on his door? Paranoia gripped him. He couldn't sit back and wait for it all to come crashing down. He needed to ensure Amanda kept quiet, that she wouldn't lead the police to him. Later that evening, Danny showed up at Amanda's house. She looked pale, shaken by Mark's disappearance. She hadn't said anything to the police yet, but her fear was evident. "You're not going to say a word," Danny warned her. "Mark's gone. You'll let the police think he ran off. You won't mention me." Amanda's eyes filled with tears, the guilt overwhelming her. "Danny, what did you do?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't ask," he snapped, his own fear masked by anger. "Just do what I say." Amanda, too terrified to argue, nodded through her tears. Danny left her house, knowing he'd bought himself some time. But it wasn't over. Amanda was fragile. One wrong move, and everything would come crashing down. And as the police closed in, Danny could feel the weight of his actions crushing him. The days that followed were a blur of paranoia and dread. Danny could feel the walls closing in. Amanda was fragile, too fragile to trust. He had bought himself some time, but not enough. Every siren that blared in the distance felt like it was coming for him. Every knock at the door rattled his nerves. The police were still searching for Mark. It was only a matter of time before someone put the pieces together. One evening, Danny got a phone call. It was Amanda. Her voice was shaking, barely more than a whisper. "They're asking questions, Danny," she said. "The police. They're starting to suspect something. They think Mark didn't just disappear." Danny's heart raced. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing yet. But they're going to figure it out, Danny. I don't know how much longer I can keep quiet." The fear in her voice was real. Amanda was cracking, and it wouldn't be long before she broke completely. Danny knew he had to act fast, but his mind was running out of options. He couldn't keep her silent forever. He couldn't erase what he had done. The pressure was mounting, and something had to give. The next morning, there was a knock at Danny's door. He opened it to find two detectives standing on his porch, their faces hard and unreadable. "Mr. Hayes?" one of them asked, flashing his badge. "We'd like to ask you a few questions about Mark Johnson. He's been missing for a few days, and we understand you know him." Danny's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I knew him," he said, keeping his voice steady, "but I haven't seen him recently." "Why?" The detectives exchanged a glance. "We've been speaking to his girlfriend, Amanda Jones. She mentioned you two used to be close." Danny nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "We were. But things ended a while ago. I haven't seen either of them in weeks." The detectives pressed him with a few more questions, but Danny stuck to his story. He was calm, collected, just like he had been trained to be. After what felt like hours, the detectives finally left, but their words lingered in Danny's mind. "We'll be in touch." They didn't believe him. Not entirely. That night, Danny couldn't sleep. He sat in his dark living room, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He had killed Mark. He had disposed of the body. He had threatened Amanda into silence. But it wasn't enough. The police were closing in, and there was nothing he could do to stop them. The fear, the guilt, the anger, it all boiled inside him. a storm that he couldn't contain any longer. He had thought he could control it, that he could outsmart them all. But the truth was, Danny was a man unraveling. The ghosts of his actions haunted him at every turn. A few days later, Danny received another call, this time from Amanda's sister. Her voice was tight, panic clear in every word. "It's Amanda," she said. "She's gone. The police found her. She took her own life." Danny froze, the phone slipping from his grip. Amanda was dead. She had cracked under the pressure. The guilt, the fear, everything had been too much for her. And now she was gone. His heart raced, the walls around him collapsing. Amanda's death would only fuel the investigation. They'd look into her phone, her calls, her connections. They'd find the pieces he had tried so hard to hide. And when they did, they'd come for him. Danny's thoughts spiraled as the consequences of Amanda's death set in. The next morning, he packed a bag, his mind racing with one final desperate plan. To leave, to disappear, to escape before it was too late. But as he stood at the door, ready to flee, the flashing red and blue lights appeared at the end of his street. The police. It was over. Danny didn't resist as they arrested him. He barely heard the detectives reading him his rights. The world seemed to close in around him, the weight of everything he had done crashing down in full force. Mark was dead. Amanda was dead. And now, his life was over too. As they led him away in handcuffs, Danny realized that this was the price of revenge. This was what it meant to lose everything.